Ever heard of Igbo Landing? It's a powerful story of resistance that'll give you chills. Picture this. 1803, a group of Igbo people from Nigeria forced onto a slave ship. They survived the horrific journey to America, only to be sold in Georgia. But these brave souls had other plans. At Dunbar Creek, they rebelled, grounding the ship. Then, in an act of ultimate defiance, they walked into the water, choosing freedom and death over a life in chains. Legend says they flew back to Africa, their spirits unbroken. This isn't just history, it's a testament to human courage. Igbo Landing is sacred to the Gulagichi people and symbolizes hope for all. So, next time you're feeling powerless, remember the Igbo. Their story proves that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can soar.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel where we dive deep into the story that history tried to bury. Today we are honoring a powerful and often overlooked chapter in African and African American history, the story of Igbo Landing. In 1803, a group of 75 enslaved Igbo people arrived on the shore of Georgia, but instead of submitting to bondage, they chose resistance. What followed was a bold and heartbreaking act of defense that echoes through generations. We are taking you to the very site, St. Simon's Island, to explore not just the history, but the sacred legacy that lives on the land, the water, and the people. This is a story of pain, power, remembrance, and resistance. So stay tuned as we journey through Igbo Landing, where the past still speaks and the ancestors still rise. Let's get into it.
For Juneteenth weekend, I had a chance to visit Igbo Landing. Igbo Landing is 5 hours outside of Atlanta in an area called St. Simons, Georgia. What I first noticed when I got there was that many of the local businesses in the area are located in plantation houses, which was so odd to me, but maybe not odd when you really think about it, because capitalism is going to capitalize. What was really interesting when we were driving there is all of the willow trees that we saw. And when you look up the symbolism of willow trees, they represent journey, struggle, and pain as a symbol of recovery and hope for the future. So I first heard about Igbo Landing on a podcast where Brittany Janae Harris mentioned it, and I wasn't familiar with it, so I researched it and knew I wanted to visit. According to blackpast.org, Igbo Landing is a historic site at Dunbar Creek on St. Simons Island, Georgia. Right here in 1803, one of the largest mass life endings, because y'all know I can't say the S word, of enslaved people took place here, when Igbo captives from Nigeria were taken to the Georgia coast. You see here, it's almost like a vacation area. People go fishing, and it's a lot of like families that come to visit without really knowing the history of the area. So according to oral histories, 75 Igbo captives took control of the ship and capsized the boat, with many of the enslaved people choosing to drown rather than being held in captivity. Here you see my mom and I throwing some objects into the water to honor the memory of the ancestors. In Black Panther, when Killmonger said, "Bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from ships because they knew death was better than bondage," he was referring to what happened at Igbo Landing. In the words of Asada Shakur, nobody's going to teach you your true history if they know that that knowledge will help set you free. We must keep retelling the history so that it is not erased and forgotten.
A couple of folks requested that I do a video on Igbo Landing, so here we go. In 1803, a group of 75 enslaved Igbo were brought to Savannah, Georgia, and sold for about $100 each. Then they were put back onto a ship that was supposed to sail to St. Simon's Island. But on the way, they rebelled, took over the ship, threw enslavers overboard, and some of the enslavers drowned. When they reached land, they walked right into Dunbar Creek. Some say they were led by a chief. They drowned themselves in defiance of slavery. And there's an actual eyewitness account by a local overseer from another plantation. This true story has influenced a number of African American folktales, including stories about Africans that can walk on water or fly back home to Africa. Representatives from Igbo land actually visited this site and declared it sacred. Many people from the local community still will not fish there because they don't want to disturb the ancestors.
Africa historically sub-Saharan Africa has been fundamental to the global prosperity of the advanced countries. Okay? And Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow sub-Saharan Africa to escape that. Okay, we do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that. Okay, and this means all the economic structures, all the global institutions, and the economics we teach everyone is all designed to keep Africa exactly where it is. And whether it is Europe or US, it's always the same. We need Africa to be impoverished because we need those raw materials and we need them dirt cheap. Okay, so that's the message. It doesn't mean to say that there's nothing Africans can do. Of course there is. Okay, but this is the opposition that they're fighting. This is what it's about. Because if Africa does do something different, I assure you living standards of all those in Europe and North America are going to fall. Okay? And that is a big price to pay. I assure you that the West is not going to allow that without a big fight. Okay, so this is what it's fundamentally about.
No, this tells Mr. Buckley why I think one can deal
what,
constructively with questions like the one you were asking about what about killing, setting up a program to kill half the people in Africa.
Yeah.
I think we should, you see, I set up an even wider thing, and I say this leads me to an absurdity. I think your question also leads to an absurdity.
I want to know why it's an absurdity. I don't think these graphs help. Do they?
Oh, you mean why your example is an absurdity?
Yes.
Well, we should
or even
explore
these.
that more, you
or
see. I think you didn't describe how these people would be killed. This would, in my standards, be a very important factor.
Painlessly.
Painlessly.
Yeah.
And so the total amount of happiness might be greater in that group of people. But would it be greater for you, Mr. Buckley, if you knew your country were doing this?
No.
Well, you see, not everybody would be happier. The citizens in this country who might share emotions like mine and my concern postulate, which was a third of the three moral postulates, truth, concern, death, I think would be unhappy with this too. And how about the people who remained? Do you think they would be happy to have their brothers, their cousins killed off this way? I'm not at all sure that your proposal would lead to anything like a maximum of happiness.
Well, again, this would be a postulation. If one assumes that there are two people in a room both starving to death, and the disappearance of one ends the problem of starvation for the other, there is, I think, almost a biologically ineluctable.
Well, this gets close to the problem solved by this, what was it, a basketball team in the Andes?
Yes.
In which they were reduced to cannibalism, and they did a lot of soul searching, and I have no quarrel with what they had to
they ate corpses. Yeah.
Well, the same thing could happen, you see, in the other area. And it might be that a group of people would gather together and they'd say, we have a contribution. It may be they've discovered some new, unique source of energy, and there are only 10 of them. And if they don't arrive back, they know that some part of civilization will be greatly damaged by this loss of energy.
Europeans have always been the worst colonizers. Let's make one thing clear. Not all empires were the same. Yes, conquest existed before Europe, but what Europe brought was a systematized apocalypse, a global, mechanized, extractive, and delusional machine built to erase, enslave, and rename the entire planet in its image. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, and the Ottomans colonized, but they didn't burn libraries to build stock exchanges. Baghdad's Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, preserved Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts. Islamic expansion introduced algebra, hospitals, and multilingual court systems, not forced conversions by musket. Arabic became a lingua franca across empires, not by mandate, but by scholarship, commerce, and adaptation. Compare that to the Spanish, who reduced Mexican codices to ashes in Tenochtitlan, declared Nahuatl satanic, and forced Catholic confessions under torture. The Mongols built the longest contiguous empire in history. Yes, they killed, but they didn't erase. Genghis Khan's court had Chinese, Persian, and Muslim scholars side by side. They taxed knowledge instead of obliterating it. If you were a doctor, teacher, or artisan, you were protected. They built relay stations and free travel passes for scholars, not railroads to plantations. Contrast that with the Belgians in Congo, who cut off children's hands for not bleeding enough rubber out of trees, and never built a single university. The Ming dynasty's reach across Asia and Africa via Zheng He's treasure fleets brought porcelain, books, and medicine, not settler colonies. Chinese colonization in places like Vietnam did exist, but it included civil service exams, Confucian schooling, and a food exchange, not sugar plantations and forced sterilization. Now compare that to the British, who called India their jewel, while creating over 30 million famine deaths through forced cash cropping and grain export during droughts. Yes, the Inca, Aztec, and Maya had conquest, but it was regional, symbolic, and seasonal. Tribute came in textiles, maize, and cacao, not slavery and amputated limbs. Sacred war, like Sochi Yao Yotl, was regulated by religious calendars and often ended in ritual rather than extermination. The Spanish responded by melting golden temples into bars, genociding 90% of indigenous populations, and naming towns after saints who never stepped foot on the continent. Europe didn't just conquer land. It conquered meaning, redrew maps, renamed rivers, invented race, mass-manufactured lies like terra nullius, turned people into property, culture into commodity, nature into capital. And then after 500 years of bloodshed, they wrote textbooks, calling themselves explorers. No Islamic caliphate ever created a global insurance market for enslaved human cargo. No Mongol horde ever renamed continents, burned genealogies, banned native languages, and then demanded tribute for the civilization they just annihilated. European colonialism wasn't just violent. It was uniquely annihilative, designed to erase the planet and rewrite it in their own rotting image. No empire before or since has done more to erase history, decimate the biosphere, and then demand a thank you note in return. Cope.
In 1803, 75 Igbo captives from what is now southeastern Nigeria were purchased at a slave market in Savannah, Georgia for about $100 each. These were men, women and children, intelligent, resistant, spiritual people who were about to be forced into the brutal system of plantation slavery in the American South. They were loaded onto a small vessel called the schooner York, bound for St. Simon's Island, just off the Georgia coast. But what happened next transformed the small creek in sacred ground and left an imprint on history that would echo for centuries. Somewhere along the journey through a Dunbar Creek, the Igbo people made a decision. They had already endured the Middle Passage, a journey marked by death, trauma, and inhumanity. But they refused to be broken. Oral account says that shortly after the boat departed, the captive rose up. They broke free from their chains. They took control of the vessel. Some say they overwhelmed the crew, threw several of the white enslavers overboard, and steered the boat towards shore. When the boats reached land, they walked into the waters of Dunbar Creek, and they were chose death over bondage. According to the oral history and one recorded account by overseas Rose Wen King, many of the Igbo captives drowned themselves in an act of mass resistance. Now, pause and sit with that. They wasn't just escaping slavery. They were making a statement. They were choosing dignity over dehumanization, freedom even in death over a life of chains. In many African cultures, water is spiritual. It connects words, cleanliness. It carries souls home. The Igbo people delivered the spirit returns to the ancestral land in death. So when they walk into Dunbar Creek, they wasn't just dying. They were going home. Today, Igbo Landing isn't marked with a grand monument. It's not a bustling tourist destination. In fact, many people in the United States have never ever heard of it. But for those who know the story, it is a place of memory. Community members from the area, especially African American descendants, often refuse to fish in the waters out of deep respect. They say you don't disturb the ancestors. In 2017, a delegation from Nigeria visited the site and held a spiritual ceremony, declaring it sacred ground. Think about the magnitude of that, a connection across centuries, oceans and bloodlines, reaffirmed by the descendants of the people who choose freedom. And yet, Igbo Landing has remained largely invisible in mainstream American history textbooks. Instead, it lives in folklore, spirituals, and cultural memory. It's echoed in African American stories about people who could fly, who rose up from captivity and soared across the water back to Africa. It inspired works like Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and even made its way into the pop culture, referenced powerful in Black Panther when Killmonger said, "Bury me in the ocean with my ancestors who jumped from the ship because they knew death was better than bondage." That line hits hard for so many people because it was rooted in real, unflinching history. When I visited Igbo Landing recently, it was a surreal experience. The land looks peaceful, almost ordinary, but the air feels heavy. It's hard to explain unless you are standing there. There is an era calmness, like the water remembrance, and the willow trees that line the roads as you approach. They symbolize mourning, strength, and survival. They almost feel like quiet, sentient guiding story. Interestingly, many of the buildings nearby are old plantation houses that now serve as shops and bed and breakfast. That duality, a touristy resort like Fegal built on top of trauma, is part of the haunting nature of the American South. Capitalism doesn't skip a beat, even in place soaked in pain. This is why storytelling matters. This is why platforms like this exist, because no one is going to teach us our true history if they know that knowledge could set us free. As Astanta Shaku said, no one is going to give you the education that is going to allow you to overthrow them. That includes the education about where we come from, how we got here, and the resistance that was always present in our ancestors' hearts. We often talk about resistance as something loud, violent, or revolutionary, but sometimes resistance looks like walking into the ocean with your head high. It looks like silence, like still water, like dignity refusing to bow. And if we don't tell the stories, they will vanish. If you don't mark the sites, they will redeveloped and paved over, turn into another golf course or luxury on condon. But not if we remember, not if we visit, not if we speak their names and keep the memory alive. So to the 75 Igbo souls who stood up and said no to slavery, who walked into the water and chose freedom, you are not forgotten. Your story lives in every descendant who carries pride, who walks tall, who refuses to be defined by oppression. It lives in every artist who honors your memory, every child who learns your story, and every traveler who stands quietly at the edge of Dunbar, listening to the wind. Before we close, remember these stories like Igbo Landing hasn't just about the past. They are a mirror reflecting the systems of the control, resistance, and memory that still exist today. And they remind us that even in the darkest time, there is light in the art of choosing self-worth. There is power in remembrance. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please like, share, and drop a comment below to keep the conversation going. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden and sacred stories that shape our world. Until next time, honor the ancestors, speak the truth, and stay free.